Get started. I'm Scott Houston, president of the Greystone Society, and I want to welcome you tonight to the Lukens National Historic District, specifically Greystone Mansion. Greystone Mansion was built in 1889 as the home of A.F. Houston when he was president of the company shortly thereafter. Tonight we are celebrating Rebecca Lukens' birthday. Her birthday was January 6th. She was born in 1794, and we try and host a program where we reflect back on Rebecca's life and her times. We are lucky to have in Chester County Susannah Brody, a storyteller specializing in children's stories, local history, living history, and worked with Susannah quite some time, so probably over 10 years, and focusing on, that's why I have the cheat sheet here, Master of Arts and Oral Traditions from the Graduate Institute of Connecticut, and has volunteered at the Hopewell Furnace National Historic Site, Chester County Historic District in here. Tonight we do the Rebecca Lukens in her own words, and Susannah has studied this quite extensively. Born in 1794, Rebecca married Dr. Charles Lukens in 1813. During the war, I guess that was 200 years ago. Maybe we should have a mock wedding. Yeah. When her husband died suddenly, Rebecca took over the mill and became the first female industrialist in the United States. She owned multiple businesses, not just an ironworks, but a warehouse and a farm, and the multiple businesses that she operated. We're lucky to get this past winter some letters and correspondence, specifically of Rebecca Lukens, that we acquired from some family members. So we're happy to look forward to expanding that. But tonight, again, we have Susannah Brody, and she will be doing a living history portrayal going back in time to the Brandywine Mansion. So tonight, we welcome Susannah as we go back in time to Rebecca Lukens. Thank you very much.
I love this room. It once held husband and children and rang with the glad and merry laughter of happy childhood. The grave has claimed them all in their young beauty, all but my two dear daughters. I live in a world of my own, and their tears will flow at the images my fancy presents. Yet I love to linger, even amid the wreck of my buried joys, and remember times long gone. My earliest memories of childhood abound with examples of my father's indulgence. My father, Isaac Pennock, was a kind and generous man. His affection was fondly lavished on me. Every innocent amusement was allowed me. Why, with my young friends and cousins, I bounded over hill and dell, as wild and carefree as youth would permit. It was a time when I never knew nor feared misfortune. I actually began to learn about iron at quite a young age. For my father, in addition to owning considerable real estate, owned 2 ironworks, and I was permitted to accompany him on business trips, an activity that caused my mother much distress. After years of being tutored at home, at the age of 12, I was sent away to boarding school. Here, a whole new world opened for me. I was rapidly improving in my studies, a favorite of my teachers and at the head of my class. For 6 years, the educational world was explored with enthusiasm. I was young, ardent, and happy. Books I read, or rather, eagerly devoured their contents. I have thought of late that if I had been more select in my reading, it might have been of incalculable advantage to me. But with no one to advise me or help me select my choices, as Solomon would say ruefully, I have devoted my life to reading everything that falls in my path. I was 18 years old when I returned home after my final school year. I was the eldest in a family that now included 4 sisters and 2 brothers. My mother was most anxious that I should assist her. She thought it was time that I learn the duties of family. My little brother George, barely out of infancy, was often put in my care. He was a delightful child. But after a few weeks at home, I prepared to accompany my father on a business trip to Philadelphia. The visit to the city was a delightful one. During the course of my stay, a friend of my mother's, Mrs. W., paid a call and introduced me to her companion, a young doctor named Charles Lukens. The doctor bowed with a peculiar grace, and for a moment I looked up into his interesting face. He was above the common height. An air of grace and dignity were blended into his form. His hair was the deepest shade of black, his eyes hazel, his other features manly and markedly handsome. After they departed, my thoughts involuntarily dwelt on my conversation with the young doctor with an interest I could not at that moment explain. That spring gave way to early summer, and nature wore her gayest garb. I recall it was a beautiful sunny day. I had just put down Scott's fascinating Lady of the Lake, which had claimed my attention for some time. I was enjoying a glorious sunset, and so lost in my own reverie, I didn't hear approaching footsteps until Mrs. W. startled me with her greeting. Her husband and Dr. Lukens were with her. The next several days were given to the duties of hospitality. Often in the evenings, we strolled along the creek that crossed our property. Whether by intent or accidentally, I never fully understood, but I always found Dr. Lukens by my side. At length, he expressed his feelings, telling me how happy he'd been since we met. "My dear Rebecca," said he, "I must leave in the morning and return to the city. The duties of my medical practice make it necessary. But will I be remembered in thy thoughts? Or will your interest move on to someone else after I'm gone? Say there, dear Rebecca, might I hope to win thy love? Shyness and diffidence at first kept me silent, but a lengthy discourse followed, and when all was discussed, all understood, our plighted faith freely exchanged. Later, in the privacy of my chambers, I yielded to the emotion, and tears of joy flowed My heart beat with a painful quickness, for I was happy. I, the happiest of happy. On March 25th, 1813, friends and family gathered to witness our exchange of vows. Soon after we married, my father persuaded my new husband to go into partnership with him at the Federal Slitting Mill. Dr. Lukens had some concern about leaving his medical practice, but truly, he had fallen in love with rural Chester County. And I think he was reluctant, perhaps, to remove his young bride too far from her childhood home. A great joy came to us in August 1814 with the birth of our first child, Martha. That following year, my father first suggested that we come here to Brandywine, stating that we could rent the ironworks for a modest fee, with the understanding that when he passed away, the ironworks would be left to me. We concluded to come, I believe, in 1816, about the time our daughter Elizabeth was born. Everything was in dilapidated condition about the mill, house, and farm. Repairs that were needed were ruinously expensive. Dr. Lukens was quite discouraged. He felt that we were spending more than the ironworks was worth. I often told my father I thought it scarce right that we should have so much to do, that the ironworks should have been put in good working order before we came. Invariably, his reply was, "What you are doing now will benefit yourselves later. For when I am gone, this ironworks will be yours." That following year, about the time our son Charles was born, Dr. Lukens commenced the boilerplate business. Now, this was quite risky at the time, for rolling boilerplate was a complex operation and a whole new branch of the iron industry. But he had high hopes for its success. Those were difficult times. The expense and investment in attempting to refit an ironworks to roll plate the difficulties involved and the expense were enormous and quite challenging. Does thee know that my husband, Dr. Charles Lukens, was the first iron master in America to successfully roll commercial boilerplate? Still, worse than those challenges of business were the deep personal losses. Our son Isaac was born in 1821, but died before his first birthday. Isabella was born not long after his death. It was about that same time that a spring freshet destroyed the dam that powered the ironworks. Having already invested everything in these new workings, Dr. Lukens took a loan from my father to make the repairs. We had to rebuild the dam, replace the water wheels, the pinion housings, the casings. It seemed like we had barely finished and were back on our way to success when in 1824, my father, Isaac Pennock, died. His will did not clearly state that the ironworks would be mine. He left farms to my two brothers, even though George was still quite a minor. But all the rest of his holdings were put in the care of my mother, with a codicil added that when my sister Marianne came of age, the real estate could be divided among the 4 daughters. As the eldest, I of course would have first choice, and I could choose the ironworks. Then in 1825, our beloved son Charles died at the age of 7. His death had a devastating effect on my health, and I soon learned that I was expecting another child. In June that same year, 1825, I lost my dear and excellent husband and commenced my long, bitter, lonely struggle with life. This parting by death is a sorrowful thing for those of us who are left to mourn the loss of what alone gave them pleasure in life. I will not dwell on my feelings back then. But when I looked around me, there was difficulty and danger on every side. A quick examination of the books showed that the ironworks had some severe deficiencies. That year came to a kinder close with the birth of my dear Charles Anna, my 6th and last child. I was left with 4 young daughters and a promise I made to my dying husband. Charles asked me to continue with the ironworks, and I promised to comply. Indeed, I knew I must do something for my children. And so, with great fear, but more courage, I began my struggle with a livelihood. I think I must have possessed some energy of character, for I look back on it now and wonder at my daring. Although my mother offered no assistance if we left Brandywine, she thought as a female I was unfit to carry on such a concern. I kindly but respectfully urged my case. I noted the promise I had made to my dying husband, the duty I had to my 4 daughters, and in a few years, the ironworks would be mine according to Father's will. My mother then startled me by declaring, as she understood the will, it was up to her to decide when the properties might be divided. She then asked that I immediately pay off the loan that my father's estate held against my husband. I told her it would be done as soon as practical, along with all the rest that my husband owed. Between my mother and myself, there had never been that endearing familiarity that ought to exist between parent and child. I can well imagine in her youth she must have possessed many fine attractions. Her intellect was superior, though her education sadly neglected. My mother possessed a vigorous and powerful mind. She thought I should leave Brandywine, that it would be folly for me to remain. Necessity is a stern taskmistress, and my every want gave me courage. Besides, I had made a promise to my dying husband. And where else were we to go? Pennock relatives were reluctant to assist me in this folly. I am sure they did not want to oppose my mother in any way. But my husband's brother Solomon came to my rescue. Dear Solomon came to help out in an emergency and stayed for 15 years. He supervised the workers and persuaded them to stay on the job. He assisted me in dealing with my relatives, and he served as a father to my 4 daughters. Dear Solomon suspended his own life and stayed all those years. He was there to help me decide how we were going to redesign the mill. He was there to offer comfort and support when my daughter Elizabeth died of scarlet fever at the age of 15. About a year after my sister Marianne came of age, my mother decided that it was time to divide the property. The ironworks was once again appraised at its now enhanced value, and I became the proprietor. By this time, in addition to the $420 a year rent that I faithfully paid to my mother, I had paid her more than $4,000. So the ironworks was appraised, and I became the owner on the condition that I pay my sisters Sarah Pennock and Martha Coates some $5,000 or close to it, being the amount needed to equalize the current value of the ironworks with their share of the real estate. But in the 1930s, that old mill had nearly fallen down. Repairs were becoming more and more difficult and more expensive. Solomon and I decided that there was nothing else to do but build a new mill. And with Solomon's help, I have done just that. We have built a new mill. We have made repairs to the mansion house here. We have built substantial tenant houses for my workers and made improvements to the farm. Not a dollar of that came from my mother or my father's estate. Now, our business is dull enough, and the competition is all around us. But I have built a superior mill, though a plain one. And our character for rolling boilerplate stands first in the American market. Solomon and I also recognized in those early days the potential advantage of a new mode of transportation, the railroad. And we invested in that. But beginning in 1837, we ran into some economical difficulties along with the rest of the nation. Cheap, poor quality iron was being imported, leaving home businesses like Brandywine without protective tariffs. My men marched in protest. Solomon and I supplied the banners and gave them time off, to no avail. Because we had already manufactured a considerable stock, we stopped producing boilerplate for a time. Rather than let my workers go, I put them to work maintaining the equipment, repairing the dam and mill race, and finally, working on the farm. I didn't want to produce more iron, but I was able to keep those workers and provide them with food for their families. It was about this same time that my new neighbor to the north challenged my right to the dam that powered the ironworks, and had for more than 25 years. That suit was quite expensive. The suit alone cost me more than $800, and I was forced to lower the height of the dam. I told my adversary that was no way to treat a neighbor. "Thee will never prosper," I warned him. My prediction came true, for he was out of business within the year. By the time the economy began to recover, and I looked forward to peace and harmony between family and neighbors, Solomon decided it was time to move on after assisting me for 15 years. The company books were now in the capable hands of my daughter, Martha, who joined the firm immediately upon finishing her schooling. But Martha found that once the economy recovered, and with the help of the ever-expanding railroad, the company was just growing too big for her young shoulders. And so for a brief time, she offered to handle my household for me instead. What a joy she has been to her mother. And then Martha fell in love. I was so happy for her when she gave her affection to Abraham Gibbons, a young man of sterling character. He has joined the firm as partner. They were wed at Fallowfield Meeting in January 1841. Refreshments were served here. We draped the long porch in canvas and decorated it with garlands of evergreen. It was really quite lovely. In 1844, after 20 years of widowhood, my mother, Martha Pennock, died. What a shock I had when I learned that her will left her entire estate to my brother George. George, who has squandered his own assets and come to Mother time and again for financial assistance. George managed to eliminate myself, my sisters, Martha and Mary Ann, and even Isaac's poor widow. Now George is claiming that I received advancements from my father's estate, left in the care of our mother for the benefit of all the children. How many times must I pay for an ironworks whose value was limited when my husband and I first came here? I think it would have broken Mother's heart if she had known and believed all of the truth about George and his activities. His efforts are supported by my sister Sarah. As a widow, my mother spent more of her time with me than any of her other children. And although we were never close, I always treated her with kindness and respect. But I have recently learned that there was a dark, a malign influence exerted against me by those around her. And my being prosperous as the mistress of Brandywine is the cause. Yet, I never knew till Sarah recently spoke out of the bitter and vindictive feelings that she has had against me. Poor Sarah never found the joy of a long marriage with a true love. And yet we, my sisters and myself, always tried to include her as part of our family, hoping that she would embrace the joy of seeing her nieces and nephews. I weary of this constant struggle, dealing with mill and house and farm and all the other businesses connected with all of that. I worry, have I done enough for my daughters? They seem content. I must smile when I see how happy Martha is with her Abraham. He is now a full partner in the ironworks, and he has helped me enormously. My two other daughters got married in the same year, 1848. Isabella married Dr. Charles Houston, and Charles Anna married Dr. William Tingley. Interesting, is it not, that two of my daughters followed my pattern and married physicians from Philadelphia. My youngest, Charles Anna, was determined to marry her young man despite my reservations. Dr. Tingley is not as well grounded as my other sons-in-law. Indeed, he seems to live for the day. Dr. Houston is a fine young man. He has also joined the firm as partner, allowing me to finally retire and get some much-needed rest. Yet, now I find that all those years of constant excitement has had a detrimental effect on me. For now, my days all pass in a dreary and monotonous manner. I need to bring myself out of this lethargy. I pick up books, but my thoughts stray to my great sadness. I pick up the pen to write in my diary, but everything I express deals with my deep sorrow. I had not wanted to mention this, but it just emerges involuntarily. Several months have passed since we lost my dear Charles Anna. And in that time, what deep sorrow have we all felt. She gave to me the baby, Annie, whose life was purchased with her own. And dearly do I love my little treasure. Although Dr. Tingley agreed that Charles Anna asked me to care for the baby and was happy to have her here with my daughter Martha nursing her, still I worried that he might try to interfere. And my fears were proved well-founded. A friend of mine from Philadelphia discovered that Dr. Tingley had petitioned the Orphans' Court in that city, seeking guardianship of his daughter's estate. I was uncertain what to do, but my brother-in-law, James Penrose, who is also my attorney, gave me advice. "I can tell thee what to do, Rebecca," said he. "Offered Bill Tingley a lump sum of cash to renounce all rights to his daughter, and he will likely take it. It need not be a large sum either, for he is always out of pocket." And so it was done. I offered Dr. Tingley $500 cash for his daughter, and he accepted. How could a father give up his own child like that? Would thee have done such a thing? Would thee? Still, I worry that he will try to interfere. Our agreement gave him visitation rights. He has only been here twice since he signed that. We hear more from his parents. Little Annie is visiting her paternal grandparents just now. Annie, what a beautiful, affectionate little child she is. dark, lustrous eyes of her mother beam at me from her pretty little face. Annie will now be the one to cheer me when I am sad. But I tire so easily these days. Forgive me, but I really must rest until Annie returns. I love this room. It once held husband and children and rang with the glad and merry laughter of happy childhood. With my little Annie, perhaps it will do so once again.
Now is a good time for anyone to ask questions that you might have about Rebecca's life, and Susannah will answer as Susannah, so then we'll know a little bit of context after the autobiography was written. So feel free.
Thank you, Jennifer. Now I'm going to put my glasses on so I can actually see you. And Jennifer, would you give me a drink of water, please? I apologize. I'm on the tail end of, at least I hope it's the tail end of a cold. Anybody have any questions? Wow.
How old was
Yes.
What was the idea of the suit of the dam? I mean, why were you being sued for the dam of a certain...
That's actually an interesting question. Thank you very much. And I suspect it probably was. She was found to be at fault in that suit. And that was probably the case. When she rebuilt the mill, she increased the size of the dam. And of course, you know, water flows downstream. So the dam was to the north of the mill, which was right here across the street. And what happened was when she raised the level of the dam, on times when we had lots of rain, it flooded her neighbor's property to the north. So he sued her. She did, in her lifetime, attempt to settle differences out of court. And most of the time she paid people off. You know, somebody brought a challenge to her in some way. She, rather than go to court, would prefer to pay them. She also had challenges to the ownership of the ironworks from male cousins. You'll have to understand that in the early part of the 19th century, women did not necessarily inherit their property from their husband. Now, most of the Quakers, and Rebecca was a Quaker, were very good about that. They believed in equality. Now, the men and women had different responsibilities, but they shared things, and the women were educated, as Rebecca certainly was. So, if a husband wrote a will leaving everything to his wife, then legally she would have it. But if he did not, and sometimes you'll read old wills, and they put in it that the wife will always have a place in the house, but basically the oldest son would inherit the property where she lives, that kind of thing. The disadvantage that Rebecca had is that her husband died at the age of 37 without a will, which really messed things up. So there were male Pennock relatives that challenged her right to inheriting the ironworks, despite her father's thing. But that early challenge to the dam was because of the improvements that she made on her business. So she was growing a bigger business. She built a bigger dam. And if they had heavy rains, the neighbor to the north of the dam's property was flooded. So she had to lower the level of the dam. I hope that answered your question. I apologize. I have a tendency to get sidetracked.
I'd like to ask if you have recollections that when you used to take mule teams up north to get the iron ore and bring it back down the next day after staying over at the host family. You used to actually bring it down yourself in the wagons to the mills.
He's a Houston. He knows more about this than I do. Rebecca did participate in all aspects of her business at one time or another. Now, certainly her brother-in-law Solomon did a lot of the general management things, not only because she was very busy, but also because there were several people that they did business with who frankly preferred to deal with a man. So he was an enormous help to her. But yes, there are records, and if any of you are interested in the iron industry, we have a wonderful advantage here in the northern part of the county and up into Berks County is the Hopewell Furnace National Historic Site. And if you want to know about the early iron industry, the furnace is a great place to go. And they have records of Rebecca visiting there and doing the business. But I actually first learned about Rebecca from a different way. I lived for many, many years in Euclid Township here in Chester County. And if you don't know where Euclid is, Lionville is in Euclid, and the Downingtown exit of the turnpike is in Euclid Township. I think that's probably the easiest location to identify with it. And on the western boundary of the township is the east branch of the Brandywine Creek. What we have right out here is the west branch of the Brandywine Creek that powered Rebecca's mill. On the east branch, there was a forge, the Mary Ann Forge, more commonly known as the Dowland Forge. And years ago, the township acquired the ruin of the old forge, which is right along the county Struble Trail, in acquiring land for open space and watershed protection. And as a member of the Historical Commission, I was asked to research the history of that forge. And that's where I found Rebecca the first time, because the Mary Ann Forge had a more than 65-year relationship with the Brandywine Iron Works. And the forge was an intermediary operation. They took the pig iron from the furnace and further refined it. And after Dr. Lukens began the boilerplate business, the Mary Ann Forge developed a specialty in creating plate iron that was then brought over here and further refined into the boilerplate. So yes, they used the raw materials from places like Hopewell Furnace, but they also had regular dealings with local forges, such as Hibernia.
What happened to Solomon? Why did he leave, and where did he go?
Very, very interesting question. and I love this, and I have to, I sometimes get into a little, storytellers will tell you the world is full of serendipity. And I love interconnections with things. And this is one of them. Solomon left. He was a very religious man. He was an Orthodox Quaker. And you'll notice in some of Rebecca's comments, as close as they were, he didn't fully approve, or rather, I should say, Rebecca thinks he didn't fully approve of some of her activity, like reading everything. After working for 15 years, I think he realized that obviously the company was going to be a success. It was a huge success. And once they overcame some of their difficulties, he at that time met a woman who was also a fellow Quaker. Her name was Susan Wilson. She was actually, in the 1840s, a Quaker poet from the area. My maiden name was Susannah Wilson. So I'm going, you know, I recognize the name. They married. I suspect by that time, Solomon was pretty secure financially, because Rebecca, let me tell you, took care of her own. Partly because she didn't want anyone important to her to be in these difficulties that she had been in from time to time. And Solomon and Susan Lukens, when they married, went off into southwestern New York to work as missionaries on one of the Indian reservations. And that is what he did after he left the ironworks. And I can't tell you right this minute, I know I have it in my notes, where I found that information, but it is mentioned in Rebecca's diary. One of the difficulties with Rebecca is, I'm sure lots of you understand, you know how you get busy with life and you don't have time to do things? She tended to write when she was under deep emotional turmoil. So, when her husband died in 1825, she attempted to write an autobiography because she wanted her children, if anything happened to her unexpectedly like that, she wanted her children to know about their parents. She frankly only got up to the point where she and Dr. Lukens married. So of course that early part, I love her language, and she's got wonderful, wonderful language, you know, like spring gave way to early summer and nature wore its gayest garb. She just has wonderful things. But most of the time when she was writing were times of deep sadness for her. She's very melancholy. So she finishes the autobiography up to where they got married, and then she got busy with the household and running the ironworks and running the farm and doing whatever else she was doing in this community. As Scott had said, you know, when we first got into this, we're thinking of her as the premier woman ironmaster, but she was so much more than that. She was an industrialist, and she was an executive, and she was an investor. She just did everything. After 25 years later, after she retires, she starts to keep a diary. And that's when we get the deep, sad, melancholy things for the most part. She is devastated by her daughter's death. And she is feeling very emotional, and she writes. So she starts writing in 1849, And she writes like every day for a week. Then she doesn't write for several months. Then she writes again. You know, she does it piecemeal. And the diary was never completed. I think the last entry is 1852. So basically, she kept a diary on and off for 3 years. The other primary source of information from her is what's called the statement. And as I said, that most of the time Rebecca prefers to settle things out of court. It's actually a Quaker kind of philosophy there. But in 1850, 6 years after her mother dies and basically leaves her entire estate to the youngest son, George, George decides to challenge her rights to the ironworks yet again. And I think it was probably a final straw, because this time she is not going to pay him off. She is not going to settle. So she goes to her attorney, and the attorney asks her to write down her memory about the business, the history of the business that she and her husband had from her perspective. And what she writes down, well, transcribed, it is a 6-page, single-space typed statement, and that's what it's called, the statement. And in it, she refers to other things, like she refers to Solomon's testimony. She refers to, you know, some of the other business associates can tell you more information on that. But basically, she records a history of the Brandywine Iron Works as she, from her position, as she knows it. And those sources are just extraordinary. Other than that, before now, we really haven't had a huge supply of her letters. But they were just acquired. I have to tell you, they weren't part of my thing because I haven't read them yet. Didn't have time. They just arrived, like, what, 3 weeks ago? Something like that.
Do we know where they were acquired from?
Yeah, they were acquired from
Family estate, and they ended up out in auction in San Francisco.
They were in auction in San Francisco. Did Gene locate them?
We just keep having to buy our things over and over again. So.
Yeah. How did you find out about them?
A dealer in Savannah with family connections let us know about it, that it was up for sale.
Okay. A couple of generations ago, there was a Houston in the family who was the family historian. He also did not have children. He and his wife lived in Teresina, but his wife was from Savannah, Georgia. So after he passed away, a lot of the things stayed, you know, they were hers. And many things ended up getting into family in Savannah. And those people didn't have the strong ties to Lukens here, so they really didn't have any great reason to have this stuff back here. They probably didn't even think about it. So some of the things got sold off. But they found out about it and were able to purchase them. So that's an important part about what's going on. This is now turning into a little commercial, huh? The Lukens National Historic District, and hopefully emerging in the future, the Iron and Steel Museum here is an important part of the local history here. And the Houston family and many others are working very hard to preserve all of that. And hopefully at some time, the district will expand to include some of the no longer in use steel mill buildings.
The old mill is still here.
Oh, the mill is here. The mill, the steel mill is still here. It's now owned by an international company, but it is still operating, and it is the oldest continuously operating ironworks in America. So where we are now is part of the Lukens Historic District. It is not part of the steel mill, which is owned by an international company. But ArcelorMittal has been fairly cooperative about helping, as in, if they have things that they're no longer interested in, they usually let the Houston Foundation know so that we can acquire some of those things. And some of the things are really kind of interesting. If you've never been on a tour here, there's a barn in the back across the street that has the steel company fire engines, even an ambulance. The steel mill used to have their own fire company and ambulance, so we have those things. And that kind of thing. And boy, did I stray off, whatever was the last thing there.
I'd like to do a footnote too. The presentation was excellent. And again, I always enjoy hearing because it's so real. You do a great job making it. But one of the things that I think the audience would like to know is that in the late 50s, early 60s, Helen Hayes in The Cavalcade of America portrayed Rebecca Lukens. And I think we have the actual records.
You do have that recording, which is interesting because the Museum in New York of Radio and Television does not. Because when I first heard about it, I assumed they would have it, and they don't, but you do. Yes, a very famous actress, Helen Hayes, it was a Cavalcade of America, was a radio show that reenacted historical things. And they actually did a program starring Helen Hayes on Rebecca Lukens. Yes.
This man Houston you mentioned, why he lived in Savannah. Is he the one that married a church organist in Savannah and then would preach to the men on Sunday morning when they worked?
That was my grandfather, Charles Houston.
Yeah. I have to be very careful because people ask me questions, and I got to tell you, my expertise ends in 1854 when Rebecca died. But I'm learning. Since I've been volunteering here, I'm learning more.
Yeah, he was Presbyterian. He was Quaker. She was Presbyterian, and he had a vow being a Quaker and joined the Presbyterian Church on her behalf.
Yes.
Do you have any idea what happened to Annie?
I do know what happened to Annie. That's kind of a sad thing. And I will also tell you that actually, obviously, Charles Anna, her last daughter, was named for her husband. She was also called Annie. So in her diary, when she mentions, it gets a little confusing. And I made the determination to call Charles Anna, and her daughter, Annie, she's also Charles Anna. So they both had the same full name, and they both had the same nickname, and I think it's easier to just separate them. Annie was raised by Rebecca. She was, a little sad footnote, Rebecca's oldest daughter, Martha, had had a child shortly before Charles Anna had her baby and died from childbirth fever. And Martha nursed little Annie. And Rebecca mentions in her diary that Martha's son was never in good health, and he'd also died young. And she wonders whether weaning him early had an adverse effect on his health. So Annie was basically raised by her grandmother and her two aunts, who lived across the street next door to each other, and they were all devoted to little Annie. Rebecca dies in 1854, just short of her 60th birthday. And she leaves in her will a trust of $30,000 to cover the care of Annie, who is at that time about 6 years old. Unfortunately, Charles Anna Tingley, the granddaughter, died when she was 12. And this is something that, we don't think about very much today. But the 18th and 19th century, the fatality rate for illnesses that we don't even think about today because, frankly, we've got vaccinations for most of them. These illnesses were often fatal. So Rebecca loses 3 children as children. Annie died when she was 12 years old. So that's what happened to her.
What killed Dr. Lukens?
Huh?
Dr. Lukens died from?
We actually don't know. It's described as a fever. It was apparently quite sudden. I don't know whether he died of the same thing that his son Charles died a month or two before, but there's nowhere where she mentions exactly what he died from. The biggest burden is that he died without a will. And for Rebecca, that caused her problems for years.
Is there a family cemetery, or are they scattered in different areas?
Excellent question. They are not all in the same place. And that's another interesting Quaker point. Dr. Lukens and their 3 children that died young are all buried at Fallowfield Meeting in Ursulton. So if you just go down this road, First Avenue, and just continue on down, you're going to get to the intersection of Ursulton. And the Fallowfield Meeting is right there. Rebecca is not buried there. Why, you ask? In 1827, this is more historical trivia. In 1827, the Quakers had a huge split. And many of the people in rural Chester County were what were called Hicksite Quakers. Now, they're the ones that we know a lot about because they were the abolitionists, they were the progressives, they were the vocal Quakers. Most of the business people in Philadelphia were Orthodox Quaker. Now, both sides claimed that they were following the original principles of the Society of Friends. They actually did not reunite until 1955. It's incredible. Rebecca was Orthodox. And what happened when the population split, in most cases, whoever was the majority of the meeting, the members of the meeting, retained the meeting house, and the minority was forced to go build their own meeting house. Rebecca Lukens paid she did the funding for the little Orthodox meeting house that's also in Ursulton. But by late in the 19th century, the population of the Quakers, once the Civil War was over, there were a lot of declines, and that population declined. The original meeting house that Rebecca built for the Orthodox is a tiny little, predominantly black church now in Ursulton. It is still an active church, but it's got a little burial ground behind it, and that's where Rebecca is buried. So they're not all the same. Now, when you get into the others, I would assume that Isaac Pennock, and now I'm looking over at the experts over here, the Houstons, I would assume that Rebecca's father, Isaac, was also buried at Fallowfield Meeting, because they belonged there. But I don't know for sure. Because he had a lot of business dealings in both Wilmington and Philadelphia, and he in fact lived in Wilmington for a while. So I don't know where he's buried, and I don't know where his wife is buried. She died 20 years later. There's a lot, and there's a lot we don't know. Rebecca's brother Isaac died at some time, but he lived long enough that he was an adult and married, but he's also gone by the time the mother dies in 1844, because Rebecca mentions his widow. Poor Isaac's widow. What did she ever do? I mean, it's one thing if George is eliminating his sisters from the will, but what did Isaac's widow do? She got eliminated too. So, do we have the records on where everybody's buried?
No, I don't know. It could be also Lumley Grove, maybe.
So, they're somewhat spread out. The other thing is, you have to understand that the Pennocks had a huge, huge history in 18th century in Chester County. The first Pennock, Joseph Pennock, had a dozen children. Many of them lived long enough, and he's the one that built Primitive Hall in 1738. And now the Primitive Hall Association is another thing that takes care of the Pennock family. And the Pennock family was more in the Marlborough Township area going down toward Kennett Square. So Pennocks are buried all over there too.
Suzanne, another little footnote. Rebecca also was a lobbyist and lobbied Congress and actually went in and tried to get them to vote before she could even vote. There's a woman vote, she could not. But she approached Congress to try to get them to about the tariffs of all the British steel coming into the United States. I was told that because I was a lobbyist in Washington, and they said, well, your ancestor was before you. So I was a lobbyist for 10 years. But she went into Philadelphia. I think it was Philadelphia, maybe down in Washington. That was a long...
Did you hear what he said? You know, when I mentioned the part where Rebecca and Solomon have their men march and protest supporting the tariffs, Rebecca Lukens was actually a Washington lobbyist trying to influence the legislature to pass the protective tariffs, which, by the way, didn't work. And when I first came across that part, I thought, at that time, the steel industry here was having some of the same complaints. You know, cheap iron was being imported, which, well, early at that time, England, and I don't know where else. Rebecca got to the point where her business, and you have to understand the importance of the railroad. You realize how heavy iron is? And before the railroad, iron was delivered by horse and wagon? The railroad just revolutionized the iron industry. And Rebecca recognized that right away. And not only did it expand her market, she was not only dealing with Philadelphia and Wilmington, she was dealing with New York and Washington and as far away as New Orleans during Rebecca's reign at the ironworks. She was doing all of that. And in addition to that, you have to appreciate that the railroad was run by steam engines, which needed boilerplate. Now, when I say boilerplate, does everybody understand what boilerplate is? I mean, the early boilers to work the steam engines were pieces, and they had to be very, very strong pieces of iron that were like this big, and they were riveted together to make that cylinder shape of the boilers for the early steam engines. So that's what each piece of what went into constructing the boilers was called a plate. So that's what boilerplate is. And that's what Rebecca made. So not only is she here in Chester County, in suburban Coatesville, producing boilerplate, but for many, many years, the largest train engine factory was the Baldwin Iron Train Works in Philadelphia. So her plate only had to go from here to Philadelphia to be part of the Baldwin engines. You know, her interaction with all of these other industries was just phenomenal. And she had to be one really smart lady, very smart lady, to know to take advantage of all of that.
In much later years, Lukens from Conshohocken, how did that family transpire? How did
Okay, now I gotta hit the Houstons over here because as I said, 1854 is when my expertise ends. He's asking about the Lukens and Conshohocken.
Yeah, we acquired the Allen Wood.
Would he step in the room, please?
They want to know if you could step into the room. Oh, I'm sorry. You can come and sit on my chair. I have to sympathize with him because I have bad knees, but he's got worse knees. This is Skip Houston. Scott, who introduced me, is his son.
I had an unsuccessful hassle of a set of stairs. I look like a pure.
Yeah, you weren't on a walker the last time.
No, I'll be off soon.
Well, thank you very much for coming.
Oh, it's a
Why
pleasure.
don't you sit
Welcome.
down here?
No, this is fine.
Okay.
No, the question about Conshohocken, that's quite an interesting plant. Actually, I was working in the engineering department at the same time, about '79, and we knew that Allen Wood was auctioning off all of its properties over in the Conshohocken. And we were asked to go take a look at it, see if there's anything that would appeal to us, maybe cranes or some other types of things. And we came back with a report that said we didn't see much that we didn't already have and maybe had later on. But the news was that the mill they had there was actually only 10 years old. And so we got a wire from a Cleveland purchaser who said he could not continue to pay for what he had bid on, and asked if we would be willing to get him out of trouble. And so we ended up looking over, finding out what they could do, and said, this is a real niche for us, because we could only go down to about 1/4 inch in what we call steel plate. Now, there's a conversion from the iron now into steel. But Bethlehem walked away from that deal, said it really didn't suit them. And so we ended up taking another look at it, and we paid 10 cents on the dollar for that whole mill. It's an interesting story, and we have a book that's called the 20 Years of Steelmaking.
Is there one here?
But it's a book that you want to get a copy of because it's a fascinating story. But it talks about the acquisition of the Conshohocken. And at that particular time, we had brought over from Conshohocken one of their top production vice presidents. And when we found that we were going to now own it, we thought the best thing to do is to have him go back and interview all of the people that worked in the plant to see how they would fit into our operation over there. The good news was we ended up finding that that actually gave us a new product that we couldn't compete with here. It was also a plant that went non-union by their own interest. And because of that, we were able to go across seniority lines, what they had here in Coatesville. They could actually have 3 different jobs. And we had some of the best rollers were women because they had the right touch. And it was quite fascinating because when we got into lighter gauge, we're talking now less than 1/8 of an inch for the auto industry and for some other types of industries. It ended up that we actually closed our 120 mill here and took over the mill and then added to it a sensible mill. I hate to talk, sensible is a multi-type of rolling mill. And we were able to come out with some wonderful plate. Bethlehem Steel just about went nuts when they realized that suddenly they had lost out. And we ended up operating that, and very successfully. I was in Washington at that time as a lobbyist, having to defend ourselves with the union people at our side, saying, we understand that if they want to become a union, they're welcome to do so. And they would have meetings every week to see if they wanted to join. And on their own, they said, no, we thank you for the beer and the sandwiches, but we're happy having 3 different opportunities. If we have a market were to drop, that we won't lose our jobs because we can get into other facets of the company. And that operated for quite a while under what the Allen Wood Company used to call their JEEP program, and the Joint Economic Education Plan. So that was an operation for us. Well then, we had a CEO who decided that he wanted to get out and he wanted to sell Lukens. So he made an offer to Bethlehem, and they were interested in acquiring us because they were having problems. I don't know whether you've seen the story on Channel 39 the other night. They had a whole story about Lukens Steel and how they built the United States. Well, they didn't know about Lukens. But the good news there was that they had the opportunity then to buy Lukens, and guess what? They also acquired the Conshohocken plant. So they were very happy now to have a multi-use plant. Now that plant still operates today, and it ships a lot of material for tankers, these double bottom tankers that are being retrofitted. So that's a very active plant over there. And we're still operating here. A lot of bridges, if you look at the turnpike, on the New Jersey Turnpike. So all those bridges that are being built across that all came off of our mill. And was gone to Lancaster and fabricated there. So this is more than you asked. That's the story about what happened about the Conshohocken plant.
We have the
That's the
same
area
problem.
That is the area you're considering Allen Wood Steel.
That was Allen Wood Steel, Charleston Wood.
There was an Allen Wood at the time?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, oh, this is a cute story. I have a little stories that have not gotten into print. But what happened there was they tried to have what we call a descaler. And the descaler is when you take this plate out of heating, it gets oxide. So they put this descaler in. It didn't work. So they could not compete in the industry. So that's what made them actually decide to get out of the steel industry. Well, what happened was, when we went over and took a look at it, they had it in backwards. So as soon as we took some plate from here, shipped it over there, put it through the line furnace, got up to rolling temperature of about, I think it's around 12 to 1800 degrees, we put it through, and it came out just as pretty as you'd ever care. So it just shows you, if they didn't know what they were doing, and we were glad because we were able to pick up a plant that really aided, and still does, to the joint operations here. So that's about it.
John
Thank
Woods, was John Woods related then to Allen Woods?
Mhm.
You know that?
Yep. It's all a family. It was all a main family. And we were good friends with my dad, who was chair of the board of Lukens, and we were all just good friends with Carlson and John. And John was more into the Foot Locker business. I think they made Foot Lockers and things like that.
John was strictly I'm sorry,
It's all right.
same kind of mill that Rebecca did, the tanks.
Well, we had 3 high. Well, the old mill we had here was called a 3 high mill, reversing mill. It actually took the material through, and it had to go up on a grade, and then there was an elevator lifted it up, and then it rolled back on gravity. But after that, we put reversing mills in, which actually rolled it in both directions, down and back. When you took an ingot out of the furnace, you took it in. It looks like a lump of sugar, big one. and you would roll it until you got to a certain length. They would then turn it 90 degrees, because what was then the length became the width. And then they would roll it out, as long as it kept it hot enough that it would take it all the way out, and it was measured for the proper thickness, then taken over and either annealed and cooled down quietly on sand, or we took it around and moved it down to our 2.6 mil to run out even to a longer plate. But the mill that you're thinking about is what we meant that we call it a sensor mill. And that looked like a whole series of mills that it would go like that through. And each time it would come out really thin. And that went into Foot Lockers. Things of that nature. So anyway, I probably gave you more than you asked for. But that was the operation.
In Conshohocken on Fayette Street was a
It's all right.
there was a Lukens family.
There's a lot of Lukens over there. Yeah, we had, actually the Lukens that came across from William Penn, there were 11 Lukens. Even one of them went out to Ohio. So there were 11 Lukens brothers.
But this was related to the family here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what Germantown was actually named after the Lukens, because it was the Germans that came over, and they formed Germantown. And you'll see Joe Lukens and several other famous Lukens parks over in the other part of Philadelphia. It's all the same thing.
As far as we know, the Lukens are all related.
Yeah.
Now, you have to understand that they are not directly related to Rebecca.
Oh, absolutely.
Because Rebecca only had daughters who survived to have children. So they were either Houston or Gibbons. And the Lukens name left with that generation here. But those Lukens, Charles Lukens was part of that same group that came over and settled in Germantown. Now, I'm going to suggest something, particularly because we've got some very, very nice students here who maybe should be going home and getting ready for bed. We probably have some other people that might be ready for that. I am happy to stay and talk individually with anybody, but I think it's probably a good time to let people leave that are ready to leave. Thank you. Please consider there is so much now to this Lukens Historic District. So look it up online. Come visit us. There are tours. There are other lectures. February is Harriet Tubman, right? That would be is it this?
February 7th.
7th.
We're having a living history portrayal of Harriet Tubman. And then on April 4th, we're having a very nice lady named Nancy Webster come, and she's going to speak about Quaker women in Chester County and their relationships with each other and the works that they did. We have a lot of great Quaker women in this area of Pennsylvania, so that'll be a really exciting one too. So keep that all in mind.
Thank you very much.
Oh, good. I'm glad you enjoyed it.